So what are Andrej Babiš and the European Commission up to again? The European Commission is asking in a letter how the Czech Republic is addressing Babiš's conflict of interest. So here we go again, once again poking around in the same mess. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a look at who reported whom or didn't. We'll look at what the European Commission has the right to do or not. And of course, we'll also look at Jurečka's conflicts of interest and why the same standards aren't being applied here. Are they being applied in a different situation? We'll find out. But first, regarding what will be discussed here with the European Commission. Andrej Babiš is supposed to resolve his conflict of interest. He promised it to the president, he promised it to the people, and we have laws for that. Babiš says that he resolved his conflict of interest by transferring his agrofert to the RSVP trust fund, and that he should never have access to these assets again, that when he dies, it will pass on to his children. But the question is whether that's true. All of this should actually be written down and sent to the European Parliament, specifically to the European Commission, and they will deal with it there. They'll look at how transparent it is, how opaque it is. They'll simply check whether Andrej Babiš is really doing what he says he's doing, that is, whether he's transferring his agrofert in such a way that he can never return to it, or if he's not doing that and is simply lying. It needs to be said here that basically this is an activity of the European Commission prompted by the pirates or STAN. Simply put, someone had to tip off the European Commission. Someone had to tell them, hey, this is worth checking out, and that's absolutely fine. If you have some suspicion that someone is doing something wrong and that maybe the Czech state might not be completely objective in evaluating this matter, and if it has some connection to European money, meaning money from European taxpayers that the European Commission is supposed to take care of, then if there is such a connection, you can definitely in some way ask Europe to look into it, and that's absolutely legitimate. Calling this a denunciation doesn't seem very nice to me, because if you have some suspicion and you want to deal with it through some trustworthy authorities and you want someone to disprove your suspicion, that's not a terrible thing. That's a fairly common thing, and I think that if Andrej Babiš did everything legally and is telling the truth, then sure, it's some kind of administrative inconvenience, but it's not a tragedy. And we don't need to talk about it as a denunciation. The word denunciation itself is kind of ugly, because if, let's say, you notify the police that someone is a criminal, you're also denouncing them. But the problem is the criminal who is committing the crime, not the person who pointed out that the crime is happening or the person who pointed out that a crime might be happening. I would compare it, for example, to when you live in an apartment building and you hear a lot of shouting from the neighboring apartments, so you report them, right? The police come to check if there might be domestic violence happening there. You are the informers. But it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong, you just have some concerns. If the police find out that there's no domestic violence happening and they're just having very loud sex, and you mistook that for domestic violence, have fun, everything's fine. If the police find out that domestic violence is happening, then as a reporter, you've done a really good thing. So that's just about reporting. But now about Europe. Again, the European Commission takes care of European money, the money of European taxpayers. It will check whether Andrej Babiš is really doing what he says he is doing, namely that he will never have access to those companies again and therefore will not be in a conflict of interest according to Czech and European laws. At the same time, it will check whether if he says and does what he does, if he complies with Czech laws, it will check whether Czech laws are in order. And actually, the result of this European audit, if we put it that way, the audit of our management and the audit of how we handle the money of European taxpayers, for example, people from Denmark, just ordinary farmers or ordinary shop assistants, workers and peasants, or managers and entrepreneurs from Denmark, Sweden, Germany, people who simply pay money and send it to us. So if the European Commission simply investigates how we handle it. And it can find out several things. First, that the pirates and STAN who filed the complaint to the European Commission are idiots and Andrej Babiš really fulfilled everything. There is no problem. And it's just a political farce. They can definitely find this out. Then they can find out that Andrej Babiš fulfilled everything according to Czech laws. But if they find out that Andrej Babiš fulfilled everything according to Czech laws, but it's insufficient according to some European laws, and in reality it doesn't limit him in the conflict of interest, then we'll find out that the laws in the Czech Republic are written out of nothing, most likely written by some hochsteplers, some little fraudsters and fools. I'm looking at you, today's opposition and the previous government, and then we'll get a fine and we'll be in it up to our ears, right? And we'll have to change it somehow. But at that moment, the blame will fall on today's opposition, on those who wrote those laws against Babiš. And I hope that if the European Commission finds out that the laws against conflicts of interest here are written out of nothing, the streets will be full and there will be an uproar. And someone will end up in the Vltava or something like that. I'm exaggerating, right? And of course, the result could also be that the European Commission finds out that Andrej Babiš is a liar and a fraud, and that he hasn't resolved any conflict of interest to the satisfaction of Czech or European laws. So we have three options. Either everything is fine, or today's opposition members are fools, or Andrej Babiš is a fraud. It's probably going to be one of those, and I think that if it turns out Andrej Babiš is a fraud, or the opposition are fools, we should always go out into the streets and say we don't like it and throw someone into the Vltava, maybe in paper form. Don't pollute the Vltava. Anyway, this is the situation around the conflict of interest. It will be resolved. The European Commission will clearly tell us where we stand. They have no interest in supporting either the opposition or the coalition here. They couldn't care less. They are mainly interested in overseeing European money because their own politicians, their own people in their own countries are accountable to their voters for how those Eastern barbarians, that is us, handle that money. Actually, the relationship is quite similar to the one between us and Ukraine. For example, German taxpayers, Swedish taxpayers, Danish taxpayers, the French, they all put together a pile of money in Europe, and then that pile of money is sent to Czechia, where we steal it. And those people probably feel the same way as we do when we put together a pile of money, send it to Ukraine, and then find out it was stolen there. Yeah, and now when Czechs are really worried that Ukraine might join the European Union, they say, oh, it's going to be terrible. Europe will send them money and they'll just steal it or siphon some off or manipulate it somehow. It's going to be awful. I think that when Czechs say this, the Germans, Danes, Swedes, French, and others must look at us and say, yeah, it must be really terrible when you send money to an Eastern country and they just steal it there. Yeah, that must be terrible. What must it be like? We have no idea. We who sent billions to the Czech Republic where it was used to build nonsense or just stolen. We who used European money to finance villas for Slovak mobsters. We have absolutely no idea what it's like when people in the East are stealing our money. No. So I'd like to compare this fear to what's happening in the Czech Republic right now, right? Here too, money is being stolen from some taxpayers, people from the West who send us that cash. Yeah, so in this regard, we need to realize this, be a bit empathetic, and understand that we don't have a right to that money and we should treat it accordingly. And when someone abuses it, when someone manipulates it, or when someone is a fraudster, we should slap their fingers because we wouldn't like it either if we gave someone money and they treated it like trash. So that's that. But hey, money that comes for free, we don't appreciate it, right? Yeah. So a bit of empathy, a bit of solidarity with those who provide us with the money, that would be really nice. And now about that double standard. Because, of course, Andrej Babiš has some conflict of interest that he has to resolve. Everyone keeps attacking him and so on and so forth. Yeah, but what about Jurečka? Jurečka also had a conflict of interest. The problem here is that Marian Jurečka had a farm, a family farm. He became the Minister of Labor and Social Affairs. That created a definite conflict of interest for him. And subsequently, this farm stopped receiving both entitlement and non-entitlement subsidies. That is, subsidies for various, production lines, investments, and so on. So they stopped receiving these non-entitlement subsidies, and that got them out of the conflict of interest. They only received entitlement subsidies. Those are subsidies that every farmer gets in a certain amount. Basically, if you have a cow, you get subsidies. If you cultivate a certain hectare, you get subsidies. These are the subsidies you get automatically so you can compete with other markets and so on. That's how it works. And then you have the non-entitlement subsidies, non-entitlement subsidies, and you have to apply for those, and you shouldn't touch those if you're a minister and you can influence it somehow. And this is something Jurečka didn't do. Marian Jurečka. However, we also have another Jurečka here, Lukáš Jurečka, and that's Marian Jurečka's brother. And he also has a business in agriculture. And while Marian was a minister, he was receiving both entitlement subsidies and non-entitlement subsidies. And here we get to the point where there's a conflict of interest from a practical perspective, and when there's a conflict of interest from a legal perspective, when you are someone's brother and that person goes into politics and gets into a situation that looks like a conflict of interest because they have a relative in a field they can influence according to the law, that's not considered a conflict of interest. Yeah, it's not a conflict of interest. Just because your brother goes into politics, it doesn't mean you have to shut down your business. It can't work like that, and that's not how it's set up. The law says this isn't a conflict of interest. And if the ministry or the government grants you something that benefits you, then it's nepotism, it's immoral, but it's not illegal. It's not a conflict of interest, manipulation of subsidies, or viewed that way. But if you have a huge holding company across Europe and you go into politics where you can make decisions about billions, during the time you're in politics, you put the holding aside, but you still do everything you can for it. And then when you stop being prime minister, you take the holding back again, and before you become prime minister again, you put it aside again. Well, of course, that's a bit of a different situation than the fact that your brother has a small farm and gets subsidies for it. That's just something different. So here, a different situation is being measured by the same standard. Yeah, that's something you need to realize. I have absolutely no sympathy for Jurečka. I don't have any sympathy for Andrej Babiš either. I honestly couldn't care less about either of these gentlemen. I want European funds, which are provided to us by our allies and partners from Europe, to be handled properly in the Czech Republic, handled according to the law, and so that we don't look like complete fools. That's my goal. So, for that reason, I'm evaluating this whole situation here, I would say, with a certain distance, and it seems to me that what's happening around Andrej Babiš needs to be investigated. It needs to be in order. There shouldn't be any mess, and the laws need to be followed. And of course, what happened around Jurečka could theoretically, sure, someone can submit it for investigation, right, to the public prosecutor's office. It could theoretically be some kind of nepotism, some kind of favor for family, something like that, which unfortunately happens, but it's not the same situation as with Agrofert. I'd like to explain the conflict of interest to you in another way, okay? Every politician in every situation is to some extent in a conflict of interest. Yeah, politicians have investments in various companies, like, $500,000 in an arms company, for example. You simply have $500,000 invested in shares of Cheesy Colt or CS Group. At that moment, you're in a conflict of interest from an ethical and moral point of view. And if you, as a politician, have $500,000 invested in an arms company, then you have that personal motivation to support armament so that your shares go up, right? So from a moral point of view, you're in a conflict of interest. From a legal point of view, you're not. Because if you were in a conflict of interest from a legal point of view, you would have to own at least a quarter of that company. Owning over 25% of that company's shares would put you in a conflict of interest. Owning just 1% of the shares, for example, does not create a conflict of interest. Yeah? In the same way, your brother has a company and you control, or you can somehow control, the flow of money so that it benefits your brother. From a moral and ethical point of view, you are in a conflict of interest. From a legal point of view, you are not in a conflict of interest. In the same way, you have the company Agrofert, you transfer it into some kind of trust, and you know that your children will get the company. You're still in a conflict of interest because you want to help your children. But from a legal point of view, you are not in a conflict of interest because the fact that you want to do something for your children so that the company does well, blah, 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 that's no longer considered a conflict of interest. Morally and ethically, yes, but according to the law, no. Yeah, this needs distinguishing. Factual, a factual conflict of interest. Well, everyone is practically in a factual conflict of interest all the time. The law is a conflict of interest. That's different. So that's how it is. Ladies and gentlemen, please write in the comments how you see it, whether you're rooting for the European Commission to really investigate this here so that our crooks finally have some adult supervision over them. Or are you more inclined towards that Schweik-style attitude, like if you don't steal, you're robbing your family and things like that? Simply put, are you more fair-minded people, or are you more the type who likes to skim something off the top on the side? Let me know how you see it, support the content, join the streams, share, follow, like, and be good. And if possible, be honest. Glory to Czechia, glory to Czech agriculture, but honestly,